The alien fleet arrived at exactly 04 Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday morning, and I was already awake. I had been awake for 31 hours, not because I was anxious, not because I was afraid, but because the numbers I had been running for the past week kept coming back the same way no matter how I arranged them, and numbers like that do not let you sleep. I sat in the operations center beneath the old League of Nations building in Geneva, 300 meters of solid rock above my head, enough to survive almost anything short of a direct planetary strike, and I watched the screens. Every screen showed the same thing: ships, not one or two, not a patrol, not a scouting formation. The Vel'Karath had sent everything they had. 4,217 warships out of faster-than-light travel in a coordinated cascade that lit up every sensor array humanity had ever built. They came out at the Lagrange points first, the gravitational sweet spots where Earth and the Moon and the Sun hold objects in a kind of natural balance, and then they kept coming, filling the space between, layering themselves into a formation so precise and so complete that it almost looked decorative. A sphere of ships around our world, every gap calculated, every angle covered. I watched Admiral Cara Dunning step up beside me. She was a tall woman, sharp-featured, with the kind of stillness that comes from 30 years of making decisions in rooms where every choice costs something. She had her coffee. She looked at the screens for a long moment. 4,000, she said. 4,217, I said. Give or take 3 that are still in transition. She nodded slowly. The civilian networks? Going loud in about 40 seconds. She set her coffee down. 42 seconds later, every screen on the civilian feed layer lit up with the same feed from the orbital telescope array. The alien ships in formation, silent, waiting. Within 3 minutes, the global news networks had interrupted every broadcast. Within 8 minutes, every government on Earth had its emergency lines active. Within 11 minutes, the Vel'Karath broadcast their message. They sent it in 43 languages simultaneously, which told us 2 things. They had been studying us for a long time, and they were not interested in being misunderstood. The voice they used was calm and clear and oddly pleasant, a constructed tone designed to carry authority without aggression. The way a doctor sounds when they are telling you something irreversible. The message said, "You are surrounded. Your orbital infrastructure has been mapped. Your defensive systems are insufficient to repel this force by a factor of approximately 40. Resistance will result in destruction. Surrender within 72 hours, and your population will be preserved as a labor and resource class under Vel'Karath administrative authority." These terms are not negotiable. They have been extended to 11 previous civilizations. All 11 accepted. This is the rational choice. That was it. No drama, no ultimatum delivered with fire or spectacle. Just a competent offer of survival under conditions that would end everything it meant to be human, wrapped in the language of arithmetic. The room around me went very quiet. I had 43 people in the operations center, all of them brilliant, all of them trained for exactly this scenario. They had run simulations, they had built contingency plans, they knew intellectually that this day was coming. And still, when it actually arrived, when the screens showed 4,000 alien warships hanging over the world they had been born on, there was a moment where the weight of it simply landed on every face in the room and nobody moved. I turned away from the screens. I walked to the secondary communications terminal in the back corner of the room, the one that was not connected to any civilian network, or any government channel, or any military uplink that the Vel'Karath could have mapped in the years they spent watching us. It was a tight beam relay that connected to exactly one receiver, a receiver I had personally helped install 11 years ago aboard a ship that officially did not exist. I typed 4 words. "Are you in position?" The response came back in 9 seconds. "Fenrir is deployed." I stood there for a moment with those 3 words on the screen. Then I deleted the message, walked back to the center of the room, and looked at Admiral Dunning. "Open a channel to the Vel'Karath command vessel," I said. She looked at me with an expression I had seen on her face exactly twice before, both times in the years we had spent building something that the rest of the world thought was a planetary defense grid, and that was, in fact, something else entirely. The expression was not hope. It was closer to the look a person gets when a very complicated machine they have been building, in secret for a very long time, is about to run for the first time, and they do not yet know if it will work, but they have done everything that can be done. "Yes, Commander Morrow," she said, and reached for the console. "My name is Yel Morrow. I am the head of Earth Strategic Command, which is a title that sounds impressive until you are standing in a room watching 4,000 alien warships surround your planet, at which point it sounds like a bad joke. I am 47 years old. I have 2 daughters and a dog named Percy, who I have not seen in 4 months, because I have been in this bunker running numbers. I am not a soldier by nature. I am a planner. I think about large systems, about how things fit together across long stretches of time, about where the invisible pressure points are in any given situation. 11 years ago, I was given a problem. The problem was simple in its framing and almost impossible in its solution. The Velkarath were coming. Every intelligence estimate we had, every analysis of their behavior patterns and their expansion strategy, and the timing of their scouting missions, pointed to an arrival window between 8 and 15 years out. They were methodical. They identified resource-rich inhabited worlds, studied them until they understood their defensive capabilities, and then arrived with overwhelming force at a time of their own choosing. They had done it 11 times. They had never lost. Conventional defense, our best analysts agreed, gave us somewhere between 2 and 4% survival odds. Those were the best numbers. Some of the models came back with 0. So I was given a different problem. Not how to defend Earth, but how to win. I spent 3 weeks alone in a cabin in northern Scotland with no network access and 17 binders of intelligence reports. And I came back with an answer that the committee I briefed it to sat with in silence for almost 4 minutes before anyone spoke. The answer was this: we do not defend Earth. We let them come to Earth. We let them commit their entire fleet to the encirclement, exactly as their doctrine demands. And while they are doing that, while they are arranging themselves in their perfect sphere with their backs to the void, we are already behind them. The silence in that briefing room 13 years ago felt a lot like the silence in this operations center now. The Velkarath had a weakness. Every species has a weakness, not in their character or their courage, but in their assumptions. The Velkarath assumed that a civilization facing their approach would focus everything inward, would pull their resources close to their home world, would build walls. Every civilization they had ever encountered had done exactly that. It was the rational response. You see the storm coming, you board up the windows. What no civilization had ever done, because no civilization had ever had enough warning and enough discipline and a certain kind of cold patience, was walk out into the storm before it arrived and get behind it. The Velkarath sensor grid was extraordinary. They could detect almost any human ship, any energy signature, any drive system we had, almost. We had spent 4 years reverse engineering a piece of their own technology from a scout probe that went silent near Neptune and drifted into a debris field where we quietly retrieved it. What we found in its navigation systems told us something useful. Every faster-than-light capable ship produces a gravitational wake when it decelerates. The wake is brief but measurable. The Velkarath sensor grid was calibrated to read those wakes as part of its long-range sweep. What it could not read well, because of the way the sweep frequencies worked, was what was already inside that wake when the ship that produced it was decelerating. The zone directly behind a decelerating Velkarath warship was a sensor blind spot roughly 300 meters wide and 2 kilometers long, lasting for about 40 seconds. 40 seconds is not very long, unless you have a very small ship with a very quiet engine that has been coasting on minimal power for 11 months and only needs 40 seconds to slip into the gravitational shadow of the nearest alien vessel. I watched the Velkarath fleet settle into its formation on the screens above me, every ship finding its place in the sphere, every gap closing, every firing arc covered, and somewhere behind every one of those ships, already in the dark, already breathing slow, already waiting, were ours. The channel to the Velkarath command vessel opened. A tone, then a voice. I picked up the headset and spoke clearly, because the next 72 hours were a performance, and I was going to give it everything I had. This is Commander Yale Morrow of Earth's Unified Strategic Command. I am authorized to speak on behalf of the governments of Earth. We have received your message. A pause, exactly the right length. We will need time to consult our respective governing bodies before any response can be given. We request 48 hours. The voice on the other end was calm. Unhurried. You have been given 72. We are generous. 48 is sufficient for consultation. We will hear your response then. Thank you, I said. I set the headset down. Kara Dunning was looking at me. Fenrir needs 60 hours to reach full deployment position, I said quietly. She nodded. 48 is not 60. No, I said. It is not. So I am going to need to be very good at this. I turned back to the screens. 4,217 ships, hanging over the Earth like a ceiling made of threats, patient, certain, already writing the history of a conquest they believed was complete. I thought of the 3 words on the terminal. Fenrir is deployed. Get me everything we have on Velkarath negotiating protocol, I said. And someone bring me a coffee. It is going to be a long 2 days. Nobody in that room knew what was coming. Not the Velkarath. Not the 7 billion people above us watching their feeds in fear. Not even most of the people in this room. And I was not afraid. The 48-hour clock had been running for 9 hours when Van Arsen spoke directly to the being they called the second voice. In Velkarath command structure, the second voice was not the leader. The leader, the sovereign authority, did not speak to subject species. That was considered beneath the role. The second voice was the designated communicator, the translator between supreme authority and lesser civilizations, a position somewhere between diplomat and administrator. It was, I had been told by the 3 xenolinguists who had spent 4 years analyzing recovered Velo-Akarath communications, a position of genuine power wrapped in the appearance of a courtesy. The second voice had a name in its own language that our systems rendered, phonetically as something like Velsoren, but our translators had been instructed to use the title only. Names implied relationship, titles implied distance. I needed distance right now, the same way a person playing a very serious card game needs the other player not to see their hand. The channel opened, and I heard it speak for the first time in real time rather than through a recorded broadcast, and I noticed something immediately that the recordings had not captured. There was a quality to its voice, even through the translation filter, that was almost gentle, patient. The voice of something very old and very confident that has learned not to hurry, because hurrying is for creatures that are uncertain of the outcome. Commander Morrow, it said, you requested this communication. We are listening. Thank you for making yourself available, I said. I was sitting at a small fast desk in a side room off the main operations center, alone except for 2 communication technicians who were running the signal. I had chosen this room because it had no windows onto the main floor, because I did not want anyone watching my face. I want to be transparent with you. The process of consulting 37 sovereign governing bodies is genuinely complicated, and I want to make sure that we do not miss the deadline you have provided due to procedural delays that I could have anticipated. A pause. You are requesting a procedural extension. I am requesting clarity on whether such an extension is possible, should the consultation process require more time than the current window allows. I am not requesting an extension at this moment. I am simply trying to understand the parameters. Another pause, slightly longer. You are being very careful with your language, Commander. I have lawyers from 11 different countries advising me, I said, and let a small, tired note of humor into my voice. Careful language is the only kind I am permitted to use. Something in the translation that might have been a sound of dry amusement. The 72-hour window was set as a sufficient period for any rational governing body to reach a decision, the second voice said. We have applied it to 11 civilizations. In every case, it was more than adequate. We are curious why your situation would be different. Our situation is different because we have 37 sovereign governing bodies, each with its own constitutional process, none of which have a provision for interspecies surrender, because we have never had to write one. Legal frameworks we are working with were designed for conflicts between human states. I am, quite literally, asking lawyers to draft new law in real time. I paused. I imagine that is not something you have encountered before. A long silence. You are saying that your species has no legal mechanism for this. We have no legal mechanism for this, I confirmed. That seems like an oversight. With respect, I said carefully, we did not expect to need one. What I meant was, we were not supposed to survive long enough to need one, by your calculations. What I was doing was feeding the second voice a picture of a species scrambling to respond to something it had not prepared for, buried under its own bureaucracy, chaotic and overwhelmed. Every word of it was true. I simply did not mention that the bureaucracy was also buying time for 137 ships to drift another 50,000 kilometers into position. We will allow the 72 hours to run to completion, the second voice said. If your process requires additional time beyond that, we will consider a short extension on a case-by-case basis, contingent on evidence of genuine progress. That is very reasonable, I said. Thank you. I ended the call and sat in the silence for a moment. In the main operations room, Kara Dunning was running fleet position updates every 15 minutes. The Fenrir ships were moving, each one a ghost, each one a secret. The operation that had taken 11 years to build was inside its final 60 hours, and it was holding. I thought about how it had started. Not with ships, not with weapons, but with a question asked in a small conference room in Zurich by a man named Owen Garrett, who ran the Velkafrath Threat Assessment Division and who had the kind of mind that found comfort in worst-case scenarios, because, at least the worst case was honest. Owen had stood in front of a projection showing 11 conquest events across 11 inhabited worlds and said, very quietly, "They win by arriving with certainty. The certainty is the weapon. If they know they are going to win before they arrive, they have already won. The question is whether we can take the certainty away from them." That was the beginning. The plan that grew out of Owen's question was called Project Fenrir, named after the wolf in Norse mythology that was bound and contained right up until the moment it was not. The name was Owen's idea. He had a sense of occasion. Fenrir's core principle was deception at a scale that no single institution, government, or security apparatus had ever attempted. We were going to deceive a spacefaring civilization with 1,000 years of expansion history, a species that had successfully studied and categorized 12 different civilizations before making its move. We were going to make them believe they understood us. We were going to show them exactly what they expected to see. The public face of Earth's response to the Vel'Karath threat was a planetary defense initiative called the Guardian Network. It was real. It was genuinely funded, genuinely built, genuinely crewed. It was also deliberately not enough. The Guardian Network was designed to look like the best humanity could do under pressure, a massive overreach that stretched our resources and still came up short. We briefed it to the public. We briefed it to every government. We briefed it to the press. The Vel'Karath watched the briefings. They watched the construction. They watched the orbital platforms go up and the ground-based systems come online. They ran their numbers. Their numbers said what we wanted them to say. Humanity is trying hard and falling short. What the Vel'Karath did not watch, because they did not know it existed, because the 89 people who knew it existed had never written a word about it on any system that could be accessed, intercepted, or analyzed, was the second program. The second program had no press briefings. It had no public contracts, no satellite imagery to interpret, no supply chain movements that looked different from standard civilian deep space logistics. It had 140 ships, each one built in a modular facility, inside an asteroid in the main belt that was officially registered as a nickel-iron mining operation. The ships were small, roughly the size of a large ocean-going vessel, designed for minimal energy signature, maximum endurance, and one specific purpose: getting behind the Vel'Karath fleet without being detected and staying there until the moment they were needed. Each ship carried a crew of 40, a drone munitions package of 30,000 units, and enough power to run quietly for 18 months. Each ship was commanded by someone who had volunteered, knowing the full scope of what they were signing up for. Each ship had been in transit for between 8 and 14 months by the time the Vel'Karath arrived. They had been waiting in the dark, alone, in silence for a long time. I thought about those crews often in the 9 hours since the Vel'Karath arrived. I thought about a young lieutenant commander named Priya Ose, who had been in command of the longbow for 11 months, who had spent those months keeping her crew calm and sharp and ready in a metal hull, 300 meters wide, floating in the outer dark, waiting for a signal that might never come. I thought about the 40 people on every one of those ships who had chosen this, who had left their families and their homes and their lives, and gone out into the void, because someone asked them to. 14,000 people had known about Fenrir. Not one had spoken. That fact, more than the engineering, more than the tactical geometry, more than the years of careful deception, was the thing that moved me when I thought about it. We had asked 14,000 people to carry a secret that could end the world if it leaked, for over a decade, without any public recognition, without any acknowledgement that they even existed. We had asked this of them because we had to, because the alternative was certain and the chance we were offering was small, but it was a chance. They carried it. Every single one of them. I have known a great deal about human beings in my life. I have studied our history and our patterns and our habits, the ways we fail, and the ways we occasionally manage something extraordinary. I have rarely been as proud as I was in the years when I watched 14,000 ordinary people carry the weight of humanity's survival and not buckle under it. Outside the bunker, 7 billion people had no idea any of this existed. They were watching the news feeds, talking in whispered groups, holding one another in the dark, waiting to find out if the world was going to end. I thought about them too, all of them, going about the small rituals that people perform when they are afraid and there is nothing useful left to do. Making tea, holding photographs, calling parents and children and old friends, saying the things that should have been said earlier. They deserved better than not knowing. I had always believed that. I had argued it once, in the early years of Fenrir, when the security protocols were being drafted. I had argued that the people of Earth had a right to know that something was being done, that there was a plan. that not everyone was simply waiting for the end. I had been overruled, and the people who overruled me were right, and I knew they were right, but it had not made the years easier. 14,000 people carried the secret so that 7 billion did not have to carry the false hope. The operations center had grown quieter as the hours passed. The initial surge of activity had settled into a rhythm, each person at their station doing their work, the screen cycling through data, the coffee going cold. Kara Dunning had not slept. She would not sleep until this was over, I knew, because she was that kind of person. At hour 14 we had our first real problem. A Velkarath patrol vessel in the outer formation ran a low-frequency gravitational anomaly scan. This was not unusual. They ran routine sweeps of their own formation perimeter to check for debris and navigational hazards. What was unusual was that this particular patrol ran the sweep at a slightly different frequency than any of their previous recorded scans, a frequency that was just close enough to the resonance band of a Fenrir ship's passive hull plating to produce a faint echo. The echo showed up on the patrol's sensors as a minor irregularity, roughly consistent with a fragment of metal debris in the kilometer-wide range. The patrol flagged it for follow-up analysis. I knew about it 40 seconds later from our monitoring of Velkarath communications traffic. I walked to the Fenrir command relay terminal and typed a message to the Longbow, which was the Fenrir ship closest to the patrol's position. The response from Priose came back in 70 seconds. It said already on it. Executing debris protocol now. The debris protocol was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. The ship powered down every non-essential system in sequence over approximately 4 minutes, reducing its energy signature to the absolute minimum, and then fired a small dispersal charge from its forward bay that scattered a cloud of metallic fragments ahead of it. From the outside, looking at the sensor return, the metal cloud would look like the original anomaly had been a loose debris cluster all along, its components now drifting apart as debris does. Priya and her crew had to do this while the patrol vessel was 40 kilometers away and getting live sensor feed. I stood at the terminal and watched the Velkarath patrol's sensor data scrolling through our monitoring feed. My hands were completely still. I had learned a long time ago that stillness was a choice, and that a person who appears calm in a crisis gives the people around them something to hold on to. But inside, beneath the stillness, every calculation I had ever run was running again in parallel, checking and rechecking the margins, looking for the point at which this could still go wrong. Priya's crew executed the protocol in exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. They did it perfectly. The follow-up analysis the patrol conducted 6 minutes later logged the anomaly as resolved. Natural debris, no navigational hazard. The patrol moved on. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Kara Dunning appeared at my shoulder. "How many more scans can we expect?" I asked. "Our models say 2 to 3 more routine sweeps before their formation settles into standard patrol rotation. After that, the outer perimeter gets less attention." She paused. "The main risk window is the next 4 hours. And Fenrir needs 44 more hours, yes." I looked at the screens. I thought about the second voice. Patient and unhurried at the center of a fleet it believed had already decided the future. "Then I need to give the second voice something to think about," I said. "Get me on the channel." The second call to the second voice lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes, and it was the most detailed, exhaustive, technically intricate discussion of comparative constitutional law, intergovernmental authorization protocol, and the procedural mechanics of multi-party international consensus building that I had ever conducted in my life. I had prepared for it for 3 years. I had spent 3 years learning exactly enough about the Velkarath administrative structure to know what would confuse them most about ours. Their system was hierarchical, clean, and decisive. Authority flowed from the sovereign down through designated representatives, and decisions at any level were binding on all levels below. They had no equivalent of a Senate, no veto mechanisms, no constitutional courts, no popular referendums. They did not have 11 governments that each required their own internal vote before a collective position could be formulated. I explained all of this, in detail, with specific examples of which governing body was currently in session, which ones were in recess and had to be recalled, which ones had procedures requiring a minimum number of days between a motion being tabled and vote being taken. I was not inventing any of it. It was all real. I was simply presenting it in a way that made it seem like a larger obstacle than I needed it to seem like. The second voice, to its credit, engaged with every point. It asked questions. It tried to find shortcuts. I patiently explained why each shortcut was not legally available to me. At one point it asked whether there was a provision under which one governing body could authorize action on behalf of all others in a declared, Emergency. I said that 3 of the 37 governments did have such provisions, but that the remaining 34 did not recognize those provisions as binding on themselves, and that any action taken under emergency authority by a subset of governments would be legally challenged and potentially reversed, which would undermine the validity of any agreement reached. The second voice was quiet for almost 30 seconds. Then it said, "Your species has constructed a system that makes collective decisions nearly impossible to reach quickly." "Yes," I said. "We have spent a great deal of our history fighting each other. The systems we built were designed to slow decisions down so that no single group could make a catastrophic choice on behalf of everyone else. It has its disadvantages in a situation like this. It is not rational. We are not always rational," I said, "but we are thorough." Another silence. "We will grant a 6-hour extension beyond the 72 hours, the second voice said at last, "in light of the procedural complexity you have described. This is the full extent of our accommodation." "I understand," I said. "I am grateful." I ended the call. 6 hours, 78 hours total from the moment of arrival. Fenrir needed 64 more. I did the calculation again, and then I did it a third time, because I had learned long ago to distrust numbers that came out the way you wanted them to. 64 hours. 78 available. 14 hours to spare. I sat with that margin for a long moment. 14 hours was not very much. 14 hours was the difference between the plan working and the plan being a very interesting piece of history that nobody survived to read. But it was enough. I stood up and walked back into the main operations center and looked at the screens, at the alien fleet hanging over the world, at the data feeds and the fleet positioning maps, and the pale faces of the people who had been awake for too long. "Listen up," I said. They all looked at me. "Fenrir has the time it needs. The window is clear. Our job for the next 64 hours is simple. We make sure it stays that way. We answer every message from the Velkarath within 2 minutes. We give them nothing they did not ask for and no reason to run any more scans than they already have. We do not rush. We do not panic. We work the problem." Nobody spoke. "These are our ships out there," I said. "Our people. They have been in the dark for almost a year, and they are about to do something that does not have a name yet, because nothing like it has ever been done before. The least we can do is hold the line long enough to let them do it." Kara Dunning nodded once. Someone, somewhere in the room, began typing. The work continued. In the 41st hour I made my third call to the second voice, and something changed. Not in the conversation itself. The conversation was the same careful, measured, procedurally exhausting exchange we had been conducting for almost 2 days. What changed was something underneath it, in the quality of the silences, in the texture of the pauses between translated phrases. The second voice was beginning to be curious about me personally, and that was a development I had not planned for. I had expected patience, condescension, and administrative efficiency, and I had gotten all three in exactly the right proportions. What I had not factored in was genuine intellectual interest from the other side. At the 41st hour, the second voice asked me a question that had nothing to do with procedure. It asked, "Commander Morrow, you are the individual responsible for coordinating your civilization's response to our arrival. In our structure, a position like yours would belong to someone with a long record of conflict resolution, administrative command, or strategic planning. What is your background?" I paused for exactly the right amount of time to make the pause look like consideration rather than calculation. "I am a planner," I said. "By training and by inclination, I think about systems over long periods of time. I try to understand where the pressure points are in a situation before the pressure arrives. A strategist, in a modest way. And in your assessment, Commander, is there a strategy available to your civilization that results in an outcome other than the one we have proposed?" The question landed in the room like a stone drop from a height. I felt the two technicians behind me go very still. I considered the question seriously, because it deserved to be considered seriously, and because the answer I gave was going to be the truest thing I had said in 41 hours of carefully managed half-truths. "I believe," I said, "that there are always outcomes that are not immediately visible from the current position. History suggests that situations which appear fully determined have a tendency to change in the interval between their apparent conclusion and their actual resolution." A long silence. "That is a very careful way of saying nothing." "I am surrounded by lawyers," I said. "It is an occupational hazard." The sound that came through the translation filter this time was unmistakable. It was something very close to a laugh. "You are an unusual person, Commander Morrow." "So I have been told," I said. I ended the call shortly after and sat in the small room for several minutes, with the weight of everything I had not said pressing around me like water pressing against glass. There is a particular discipline required for sustained deception, one that most people underestimate. It is not the fabrication that costs you. A single lie told once is simple. What exhausts you is the architecture that has to support it. Every true thing must be true in the right direction. Every genuine emotion must be the correct genuine emotion. Every moment of apparent spontaneity must land exactly where you need it to land. 41 hours of presenting a species as overwhelmed and scrambling, while simultaneously running the most complex coordinated covert military operation in human history, was the hardest sustained mental effort I had ever made. I was not performing incompetence, which would have been transparent. I was performing the specific kind of human chaos that comes from genuine capability meeting, genuine institutional complexity. And those are two different things, and getting the difference right was everything. I thought about a man named Colin Marsh, who worked 3 desks down from me in the early years of Fenrir, and who had a photograph of his son on his desk that he turned face down when he was working on anything Fenrir related, because he said it was easier. Not because the work made him ashamed, because looking at his son's face while planning something this large and this dangerous made the gap between what he was doing and what his son knew about him feel unbearable. Colin had been on the project for 9 years. He had never told his son what he did. His son believed he ran logistics coordination for a mining consortium in the asteroid belt. I thought about Dr. Nina Hale, who had led the team that reverse-engineered the Velkareth sensor blind spot technology from the Neptune probe. Nina was one of the most gifted engineers of her generation, and she had published exactly 0 papers in 11 years, which for a person of her caliber in a normal research career would have been a professional collapse. She had quietly allowed her academic standing to dissolve, watching colleagues with a fraction of her ability collect recognition and position, because the work she was actually doing could not exist in the light. She had given up her name in science so that the work could survive. I had asked her once, near the end of a very long planning session, whether she resented it. She had thought about it for a moment and said, "I will resent it if it does not work." I thought about all of them, the people who had built this in the dark, and I felt the responsibility of the next 27 hours with a clarity that left no room for anything else. At hour 53, a second crisis arrived, and it came from a direction I had not anticipated. A ship in the Fenrir Outer Ring, designated F-91 and commanded by a lieutenant named George Adler, sent a compressed signal through the covert relay. The signal carried a priority code that meant exactly one thing. The ship was compromised in some way but had not yet been detected. George Adler's message was precise and calm, which I appreciated enormously. He outlined the problem with the directness of someone who has been alone in the dark for 9 months, and has learned that directness is a form of respect for the people trying to help you. His ship's passive gravity coupler, the device that kept F-91 aligned with the sensor shadow directly behind its paired Velkarath vessel, had developed a fault in its primary alignment ring. Without it, F-91 would drift out of the sensor shadow at a rate that made it detectable in approximately 4 hours. Repairing it required replacing a component from the external maintenance bay, and the replacement procedure would produce a thermal signature lasting roughly 90 seconds, detectable at close range by any Velkarath vessel running an active scan. He outlined 3 options and asked for guidance. Remove the ship from the strike formation entirely. Attempt the debris masking protocol and hope the drift was slow enough to be managed, or attempt the repair and accept the thermal risk. Read his message twice. Then I thought about George Adler, who I had met once during a training review 2 years into the program. He had sat in the back of the room and asked questions that were half the length of everyone else's questions and twice as precise, and I had flagged his name that same day. He had been in space for 9 months with 39 other people in a metal hull, waiting, and now he had a broken coupler and a 4-hour window, and he was asking me what to do. I typed back 1 sentence, "Your call, Commander Adler. You know your ship and your crew. Whatever you decide, you have our full support." 13 minutes passed. His response was 4 words. "Attempting repair. Wish us luck." I watched the thermal monitoring feed for the relevant sector for 91 minutes. There was one small spike at the 17-minute mark, brief and faint, lasting for 88 seconds. The nearest Velkarath vessel was running a passive sweep at that moment. Passive, not active. The detection threshold for a thermal event of that size at that distance, in the electromagnetic interference generated by the Velkarath fleet's own combined drive emissions, was at the absolute edge of the passive sweep's resolution limit. It did not register. F-91 systems came back online with full function at the 94-minute mark. George Adler sent a single word. Fixed. I let myself feel something for 10 seconds. Then I closed the feeling and went back to work, because feeling things properly was something I had been putting off for 4 days, and I was getting better at it, and there would be time later. If this worked, there would be time for all of it. At hour 58, with Fenrir needing 6 more hours to complete its final positioning, a Velkareth formation vessel ran a broad-spectrum communications sweep as part of its standard patrol rotation. In 11 previous conquest events, this sweep had caught nothing, because no civilization they had encountered had been running a hidden fleet inside their own formation. What the sweep flagged was a maintenance buoy on the outer edge of the Guardian network, one of humanity's legitimate public defense installations, running a scheduled diagnostic on a frequency that our maintenance schedules had set 6 months ago and that nobody had thought to cancel in the chaos of the past 2 days. The buoy's signal was completely innocent. It was also, by timing alone, on a frequency the Velkareth sweep was calibrated to flag. 2 Velkareth vessels broke formation and moved to investigate. The movement created a gap in the formation's outer layer, directly adjacent to 3 Fenrir ships completing their final drift into position. If those ships moved so much as a meter under power before the gap closed, the gravitational disturbance would be detectable. I sent the alert to Fenrir Command. The 3 ships froze, everything off. Minimum life support only. They would drift on momentum, which would get them to their final position in 11 hours instead of 6. I needed 5 hours I did not have. I opened the channel to the second voice. I reported the buoy activity myself transparently and immediately, framing it as a scheduling error I was embarrassed by and wanted to address before it caused a misunderstanding. I let the right amount of tiredness into my voice, because the tiredness was completely real and because it was exactly the right emotional color for the moment. The second voice dispatched its vessels to assess the buoy. It took 22 minutes. The vessels confirmed a maintenance installation, logged it as a minor Guardian network component, and returned to formation. The 3 frozen Fenrir ships drifted on. I tracked them on the positioning display for the full 11 hours. 3 small objects moving on momentum through a formation of 4,000 warships, carrying 120 people who had nothing to do but breathe slowly and trust that the plan was holding. Each millimeter of movement on that screen represented thousands of kilometers in reality. I watched them move and thought about what it costs a person to be that patient, to have come that far, and to sit in a dark and cold ship knowing that one wrong vibration means everything ends here. At hour 67, 1 hour inside the extended deadline, Fenrir Command transmitted a single message. All 137 ships in final position, outliers on independent strike trajectory. Ready on your signal. I read it 3 times. Then I walked to the center of the operations room and showed it to Kara Dunning. She looked at it. She looked at the screens. She looked at me. When, she said. I am going to make one more call first, I said. She nodded and said nothing else. She understood, I think, that this was not about tactics. The tactical decision had been made. This was something else. I went to the small side room. I sat down at the terminal. I thought about what I wanted to say, and then I thought about whether I needed to say it at all, and I decided that I did. Not for any reason that could be written in a plan. Because I was about to change the shape of everything, and the person on the other end of the channel deserved, at minimum, to know that the person doing it was not indifferent to what it meant. I opened the channel. Commander Morrow, the second voice said, the deadline approaches. Do you have a response from your governing bodies? I do, I said, but before I give it, I want to say something to you directly, not as a formal part of the record. A pause. We are listening. I am sorry for what is about to happen, I said. I mean that without any reservation. You came here believing you understood the situation. You studied us carefully, and you ran your analyses and you reached a conclusion that, given the information you had, was completely rational. That is not a failure of intelligence or judgment on your part. It is simply that there was information you did not have. I paused and chose the next words carefully. You should have studied our history more carefully, not our wars. We have a great many wars, and they are not the most interesting part. You should have studied our chess. Silence. Commander Morrow, the second voice said slowly. What have you done? I gave you a 72-hour surrender window, I said. We gave you 11 years. I ended the call. I walked back into the operations center. Send the signal, I said. Kara Dunning turned to the signal console. The signal went out. On 137 screens in 137 ships scattered through the darkness inside a perfect alien formation. 137 crews who had been waiting in the dark for somewhere between 8 months and 14 months, Saw a single word appear, Fenrir, and they began to move. The first 40 seconds were unlike anything I had ever seen on any screen. Not because of the scale, though the scale was almost impossible to hold in the mind at once. Not because of the speed, though everything happened faster than our most optimistic planning models had projected. It was the geometry of it. For 11 years I had been looking at a tactical diagram showing the positions of the Fenrir ships relative to the Velkarath formation, seeing them as blue dots suspended in a sea of red, and now I was watching those blue dots ignite in real time, each one lighting up precisely where our models had placed them. Each one in a single location the Velkarath had never thought to look, directly behind their own ships. Every spacefaring civilization that humans had found evidence of, in the ruins and debris fields of the 11 worlds the Velkarath had conquered, built their warships along the same principle, heavily armored forward and laterally, where threats from deep space could approach. Lighter armor aft, in the drive section, because nothing in the history of their experience had ever attacked from the direction of your own formation. Nothing had ever been in a position to do so, until now. The Fenrir ships did not attempt to engage every vessel in the formation. The targeting protocol we had developed over 4 years of analysis had identified 260 primary command and coordination vessels, the ships whose loss would most rapidly degrade the fleet's ability to function as a unified force. 137 Fenrir ships, each carrying 30,000 drone munitions, released their full payload in the first 60 seconds of the engagement. 4,110,000 individual munitions spread through the formation in a pattern that our targeting software had been computing for 3 years. I stood at the central tactical display and watched the red markers on the screen begin to go dark, one at a time at first, in the outer command tier that had been the primary targets, then in pairs and small clusters as the drone swarms reached the secondary tier, then in a cascade that moved through the formation the way a wave moves through water when the thing that generated it was very large and very fast. The room around me had gone completely silent. 43 people watching the same display, and not one of them made a sound for almost 90 seconds. The silence was not shock. It was the silence of people who had been working towards something for 11 years watching it happen, and finding that the gap between imagining a thing and seeing it is wider than any preparation makes it. I had a word for what I felt. I had thought about this moment many times over many years, and I had prepared myself carefully for a range of emotional responses, and the word I had arrived at was not triumph, it was not relief. The word was grief, mixed with something that sits alongside grief but does not have a name in any language I know. Grief for the crew members on those markers, even the ones who had come to end our world, because a crew member is still a person, and a person still has a life behind them that ends when the marker goes dark. Grief for the Fenrir crews who had already been lost in counterfire before I had finished that thought. I had chosen this. I had planned it over 11 years and built it piece by piece and sent the signal. That was not a burden I was going to pretend away. The Velkarath responded faster than our best-case projections. I want to be clear about this, because accuracy matters more than a satisfying story. The Velkarath were a genuinely extraordinary military force, and what happened in the next 30 minutes was not a simple overwhelming of an unprepared enemy. It was a real battle, and it was real in the way that means people on both sides did not come back from it. Within 11 seconds of the first Fenrir ship opening fire, the Velkarath fleet had begun broadcasting emergency reorganization protocols. Within 22 seconds, surviving command vessels were attempting to form defensive clusters, repositioning to protect one another's vulnerable aft sections, adapting the formation in real time. Within 40 seconds, they were returning fire, and the fire was targeted and precise and effective. 4 Fenrir ships were destroyed in the first 3 minutes of the engagement, subsenting more sustained damage significant enough to reduce their operational capacity. Each of those losses showed on the tactical display as a status change, a marker shifting from active green to damaged yellow or silent red, and each one was a specific thing: a ship I had reviewed in the selection process, a commander whose name I had read, 40 crew members who had waited 9 months in the dark and who had done everything right. I watched each marker change and I did not look away, because looking away is a different kind of choice and I was not going to make it. At the 6-minute mark, the drone swarms reached their second phase targets, the support vessels that sustained the fleet's operational endurance, resupply ships, maintenance platforms, the slow and lightly armored infrastructure that kept 4,000 warships functional across extended deployment. Taking out the support layer did not immediately reduce the fleet's combat power, but it put a clock on any extended engagement. A fleet that cannot repair or resupply is eventually a fleet that runs out of options. At the 11-minute mark, the Velkarath command clusters had stabilized enough to begin a coordinated response. And it was a better response than our models had predicted. 3 command vessels working in concert had identified the pattern in the Fenrir drone munitions and developed a counter-pattern within 10 minutes of the first strike. It involved using the formation's own density as a protective layer, rotating reserve vessels as screens to absorb drone swarms before they reached the remaining command tier. It was elegant. I recognized it as elegant even as I recognized that it was going to cost us significantly if it was allowed to develop. Cara Dunning saw it at the same time I did. She was already at the communications board when I reached her. "The 3 outliers," I said. "Already signaled," she said. "They are repositioning." The 3 Fenrir ships that had missed their original positioning window, the ships that had spent 11 hours drifting on momentum in the dark, were now the most important ships in the entire operation. Not as additional strike capacity, though they carried that. As saboteurs, the Velkarath fleet's ability to coordinate depended on a network of faster-than-light relay beacons positioned at the formation's edges, small automated nodes that allowed instantaneous communication between vessels too far apart for direct signal exchange. Without the relay network, the formation's command coordination dropped from instantaneous to delayed by the speed of light, which at the distances involved meant delays measured in minutes. The 3 outlier ships had not been part of the main strike formation, but they had, through a combination of the original positioning error and 11 hours of careful momentum drift, ended up adjacent to 3 of the 6 primary relay nodes. No plan had put them there. They had arrived there through the accumulated consequence of a broken coupler, a repair done in near darkness, and 11 hours of disciplined inaction. They did not target the surviving command ships. They targeted the relay nodes. All 3 nodes went offline in a 40-second window. The effect was immediate and visible on the tactical display. The defensive counter pattern that had been developing over the previous 8 minutes lost its coherence and dissolved. Ships that had been operating in coordinated response broke into independent action. The Velkarath were still dangerous, individually and in small clusters, but they were no longer a single mind operating across 4,000 bodies. They were 4,000 separate decisions happening simultaneously, without a shared framework to organize them. For the next 22 minutes, the engagement was a series of individual actions across an area of space larger than the distance from Earth to the Moon. And in individual actions, positioning matters more than numbers. The Fenrir ships had positioning, specifically designed and specifically chosen, and they used it. At the 34th minute, something happened that none of our models had predicted. The survival Velkarath vessels with communications capability began to consolidate. Not retreating toward the edge of the formation and away, not continuing to press the engagement. Moving inward, toward the center of what had been the formation, clustering together in a single mass of roughly 600 ships, and then once consolidated going still. Not attacking, not fleeing, waiting. I watched this for 90 seconds before I understood what it meant. Then I understood, and the understanding arrived not as a tactical calculation, but as something more personal, because I had sat across a communications channel from the second voice for almost 3 days, and I had spent that time learning to read what it was actually doing underneath what it was saying. The Velkarath command had just run the same calculation Earth had run 11 years ago. They had looked at their situation, assessed the options, and chosen the one that preserved the most. They were not going to fight to the last ship in a battle that had been decided. They were not going to run and give up any leverage they still held. They were going to go still and make the other side name the next move. It was, I thought, exactly what I would have done. Cara Dunning appeared beside me. "They are not running," she said. "No, and they are not attacking, no." The cluster held its position for 4 minutes. Then the communications board lit up. The second voice was calling. I walked to the headset. The room was quiet. Command picked it up. The voice was the same. Calm, unhurried, carrying none of the fracture I had half expected to hear. Whatever the second voice was experiencing, it had the discipline to keep it out of its voice, and I respected that completely. "I am here," I said. "How long did you plan this?" The question was quiet, direct. The most honest question it had asked me in 3 days, and it deserved the most honest answer I had given in 3 days. 11 years, I said. "From the day we confirmed your approach trajectory." Silence. 11 years, it said again, differently. The way a person says a number twice when the first time they said it they were repeating information and the second time they are understanding it. 11 years, I confirmed. Your species maintained this concealment for 11 years. 14,000 individuals by our revised estimate. Yes, none disclosed it. None. The silence stretched out for a long time. I did not fill it. Outside in a world I could not see from 300 meters underground, 7 billion people were still watching news feeds showing an alien fleet in formation over Earth. Nobody had told them yet what had changed in the last 34 minutes. I had decided not to say anything until I knew how this call ended, because the hardest kind of hope to take back from people is the kind you gave them prematurely. When the second voice spoke again, something had shifted. Something very small and very precise, the way a key turns in a lock, not dramatic, just a change in the state of the mechanism. We did not believe your species was capable of that, it said. I know, I said. That was the plan. The second voice was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted them. Commander Morrow, it said at last, we would speak about terms. I had prepared for every outcome I could model. I had protocols for a successful strike, a partial strike, a failed strike. I had contingencies for the Vel'Karath, pressing their numerical advantage, for a fighting retreat, for a regrouping attempt with unknown reserves. I had thought, over 11 years, about almost every direction this could go. I had not written a protocol for the Vel'Karath choosing to negotiate. Every scenario I had planned ended in a result, a win or a loss, a withdrawal or a continuation. This was something else. This was a door held open, and what was on the other side of it had no model, no precedent, no plan. Someone was going to have to decide what humanity wanted from this moment, in real time, without preparation, with the weight of 11 years and 312 people, and 7 billion lives pressing on every word. I pulled up a blank document on the tablet in front of me. I looked at the cursor blinking. Behind me, 43 people were holding very still. I thought about everything that had brought this moment into existence. I thought about what it was for, and what it asked of me now. We are listening, I said. The negotiations lasted 19 hours. I conducted them without sleeping, which meant by the end I had been awake for well over 80 hours. And I was running on a specific kind of clarity that comes from exhaustion that has burned through every available layer of distraction and left only the thing underneath, which is the actual thinking. Everything felt very simple. The noise had been stripped away by fatigue and time, and the sheer weight of what had just happened. I had one job left, and it was to get this right. Not for history, not for my record, not for any version of what comes after that I would be alive to see, but for 312 people who could not speak for themselves anymore, and 7 billion who could not speak yet because they still did not know the sky had changed. The second voice and I spoke for 19 hours, and what those hours produced was unlike anything in any diplomatic record humanity had ever created, because it was genuinely improvised on both sides. We were both working without a script. The second voice had come to this conversation prepared for a certain kind of result. A structured framework of defeated party concessions. The standard mechanics of a civilization accepting the terms of a superior force. I had come to this conversation with no framework at all and a blank page. What I discovered in those 19 hours, which I had not known before with any certainty, was that the second voice was capable of genuine flexibility when the situation demanded it. Not softness, genuine adaptability, the same quality that had allowed the Vel'Karath fleet to reorganize in 11 seconds after an attack from inside its own formation was operating now in the negotiating space, and it meant that the conversation moved faster and went further than I had expected. I learned things about the Vel'Karath in those hours that our intelligence services had not gathered in 11 years of analysis. I learned that their expansion was not driven by shortage. They were not a species reaching outward, because they had consumed everything at home. The driver was something older and, in a way I found both familiar and troubling, something very close to recognizable, the assumption that expansion itself was the proof of health. They had been moving outward across their region of space for so long that the original reason for the movement had been absorbed by the movement itself. They expanded because expansion was what they were. It had become their definition of success rather than a means toward it. I recognized that pattern. Humanity had told itself that story in different languages across 4,000 years, and the version we told ourselves had produced some of our worst chapters. I did not say this to the second voice. I filed it in the part of my mind that was already thinking past this conversation, past this week, toward the longer shape of what came next. The terms I proposed were not what the second voice expected from a winning party. I think it had arrived at this conversation braced for the standard logic of victory. You won, therefore you extract the maximum possible concession. and the defeated party absorbs the cost and spends the next generation planning the reversal. This is how conquest has worked for most of recorded history, on most worlds where recorded history exists. I had read enough of our own history to know exactly what that cycle produced, and I was not interested in starting it. What I offered was this. The Vel'Karath surviving vessels were permitted to withdraw with their ships and their crews. No pursuit beyond the solar system boundary. No additional military engagement provided the withdrawal was orderly and verified. In exchange, the 11 civilizations they had previously placed under administrative authority were to be released fully, and without conditions. Their systems returned to their own governance, their populations freed from labor and resource obligations. The entire administrative apparatus dismantled within a timeline that was defined and monitored by a joint oversight mechanism that we would need to build from scratch, because nothing like it had ever existed before. As a separate matter, distinct from the release of the 11 worlds, Earth would receive the technical specifications for the Vel'Karath sensor-blind zone technology and the faster-than-light relay beacon system. These were not presented as punishment or reparation. They were presented as a condition of ceasefire, factual and practical in framing. The technology had been used against Earth's adversaries in the engagement. It had therefore already been deployed in the conflict, and its specifications were a legitimate element of any resolution. The second voice challenged the relay technology condition first. It argued that the relay network was a logistical and communications infrastructure, not a weapons system, and that its specifications were outside the scope of a military ceasefire agreement. I explained, without raising my voice, that the relay network had been a direct and intentional target of military action during the engagement, that its destruction had been a pivotal tactical element, and that a technology which had been both targeted and successfully neutralized in open conflict was fully within the scope of resolution terms. I cited 3 specific precedents from human international law, which I had chosen in advance specifically because they were clear, and because explaining them in full would take time. The second voice pushed back on the 11-world release timeline. It argued that dismantling administrative infrastructure across 11 separate systems on any accelerated timeline created logistical instability that was not in the interest of the populations being released. I said that I appreciated the concern for the stability of the release process, which was genuine, and that the timeline I had proposed was not accelerated but rather minimum necessary, and that oversight mechanisms could be built to address genuine logistical complications as they arose, without using logistical complexity as a reason to delay the fundamental restoration of self-governance. You are applying your legal reasoning to a context it was not designed for, the second voice said at one point. That is what I do, I said. I have had considerable practice. There was a pause that, in the texture of our long exchange, I had come to read as the second voice reconsidering its position, rather than preparing a counter-argument. We went through every term 3 times. The second voice found the limits of what I would move on, which was nothing, and recognized those limits not as inflexibility but as design. I think it understood that the terms I was proposing were not the maximum I could have asked for, and that the reason I had not asked for more was deliberate rather than ignorant. Near the end of the 17th hour, the second voice asked me directly, "Why are these terms so restrained? You have won. Your position allows for considerably more than this." I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I have studied what happens after victories where the terms are not restrained," I said. "The pattern is consistent across cultures and centuries. Punitive terms create resentment. Resentment builds across generations. The next conflict is larger than the one that preceded it. I am not trying to win a conflict. I am trying to close one. Those are different objectives and they require different terms." A long silence. "That is also a strategic calculation," the second voice said. "Yes," I said. "Everything is a strategic calculation. The question is which timeline you are calculating across." The second voice accepted the terms at the 19th hour. Before the channel closed, it said something I had not anticipated. "We will carry the record of this engagement back to our home systems. It will be studied extensively." "I would expect nothing less," I said. "We will note that the primary factor in the outcome was not your technology, or your munitions capacity, or your fleet positioning, though all of those were significant. The primary factor was the 11 years of collective discipline maintained by your species without a single failure. That is an accurate assessment. It is a quality we did not attribute to you." I said. "That was the plan." The last one. "Goodbye, Commander Morrow." "Goodbye," I said. The channel closed. I did not move for a while. I sat in the small communications room with the headset resting on the desk, and the walls quiet around me, and the faint sound of people in the operations center beyond the door, beginning to let themselves feel something. I sat with the weight of the past 80-something hours, and let it be exactly as heavy as it was, and I did not try to manage it or shape it into anything useful. There is a particular strangeness to the end of a thing that has been your entire life for a very long time. The problem had been a companion. It had shaped my thinking and my choices and the way I moved through rooms and conversations for 11 years. It had been present in every decision I made, not always in the foreground but always there. The way a load-bearing wall is always there even when you are not looking at it. And now the wall was no longer needed, and the sudden absence of that weight was not lightness. It was more like the feeling of a sound you have lived with so long that you only notice it when it stops. I thought about the memorial service the next morning. 312 names. I had the list. I had insisted on reading it personally and in full at the service, every name, because a name is the minimum that a person is owed by the people who sent them into the dark. Some of my staff had suggested a shorter format, given the public nature of the event and the scale of everything else that would need to be announced and explained. I had said no, and I had said it in the way that I said things when the answer was not going to change. 312 people who had spent months in the dark carrying a secret, and who had done everything right, and who were not coming back. The least the rest of us could do was say their names out loud, in front of everyone, and mean it. I thought about Priya Ose, who had already sent her return trajectory confirmation, and who had, according to the message from Fenrir Command, responded to the news that the engagement was complete by sitting in silence for 4 seconds and then saying, "All crew present and accounted for," requesting permission to go home. I had sent back 2 words, permission granted. I had wanted to say more. I would say more when she landed, when I could say it in person the way things like that are meant to be said. I thought about George Adler on F-91, who had fixed a coupler in the dark with enemy ships 40 kilometers away, and sent back 4 words, and whose 4 words had told me more about the kind of people I was working with than any personnel file ever had. I thought about Colin Marsh, who could turn his son's photograph face forward on a desk that no longer had to hold anything back. I thought about Nina Hale, who had 11 years of extraordinary work sitting in classified files that were about to be declassified, who was going to get to publish after all, who was going to have her name back in the field she had given it up for. I thought about Owen Garrett, who had asked the question that started everything, in a small conference room in Zurich, and who had died 3 years into the project without knowing whether it would work. I thought about what Owen would have made of the answer. I stood up and walked out of the small room and into the operations center. It was quieter than it had been in 4 days. The adrenaline had spent itself. People were sitting rather than standing, some eating for the first time in what was clearly a very long time, all of them carrying the slightly loose look of people whose bodies are presenting the bill for days of emergency reserves. A young signals analyst named Vera Hollis had fallen asleep at her station. Someone had put a jacket over her shoulders. I looked at her for a long moment and thought, she has done her part. Whatever comes next, she has done her part, and she gets to sleep. Cara Dunning was at the window, the false window, 300 meters of rock above it and a sky we could not see from here. I stood beside her. We did not speak for a while. We had been through the kind of thing together that does not resolve into easy conversation. The silence was its own communication, and we let it be that. "Priya's coming home," Cara said finally. "All the outliers are coming home," I said. "The longbow confirmed its return trajectory an hour ago." She asked about the engagement record. "Wants to know how the debris protocol looked in the tactical log." "Tell her it was perfect," I said. "Tell her it was, without any exaggeration, the most precise improvised execution under direct surveillance pressure that I have ever seen in a career spent watching people do difficult things." Cara almost smiled. "I will tell her exactly that," she said. I looked at the screens. The Velkareth fleet was in motion. The sphere that had surrounded our world was dissolving, ship by ship, the formation breaking apart into departure vectors, the gaps widening, the stars becoming visible again in the spaces between the hulls. After 4 days of watching a wall of alien warships fill every orbital display, like a ceiling made of certainty, seeing open space in those gaps felt like something I did not have a word for. Not safety, not victory. Something simpler and harder to name, like the feeling of a window opened in a room that has been closed for too long. On the table behind me, a folder. Inside it, a single blank page with 1 line of text at the top. Treaty Framework, Galactic First Contact Protocol, Draft 1. I had asked for this document before the signal was sent, because I had known, even then, that the most important thing we could do in the first hours after this ended was not to celebrate or to rest but to begin writing the next thing. Whatever came after the Velkarath, whatever other civilizations were out there, watching what had just happened and revising their understanding of what the small blue world was capable of, we were going to need a framework, not a weapon, not a defense, a way of speaking to the unknown that reflected who we were at our best, rather than who we were when we were afraid. I walked to the table. I picked up the folder. I opened it. I looked at the blank page for a long time. I thought about 11 civilizations that were about to receive word that their occupation was over. People who had been living under the Velkarath administrative system for varying lengths of time, some for years, some for generations, some long enough that freedom was something their grandparents remembered, and they did not. I thought about what those people would need from humanity in the weeks and months ahead, what it means to be freed by a species you have never met, what trust looks like when it has to be built from nothing. I thought about Owen and what he might have said, standing here at this moment. Owen was practical in the way that people are practical when they have genuinely come to terms with worst-case scenarios, which meant he would have already been thinking past the current situation to the next one. He would have been asking, what does Earth look like to the rest of the galaxy in the morning? Not today, not now, but tomorrow, when the news has spread and everyone who can observe this star system has had time to process what just happened here. I thought, we look dangerous. An operation like Fenrir looks dangerous to anyone watching it from the outside. A species that can hide a military force of this size for 11 years, that can maintain secrecy across 14,000 people for a decade, that can execute something this complex in absolute silence, is not a species that any rational actor will want to treat carelessly. That is useful. It is also frightening in the wrong direction, and the wrong directions can produce the wrong response, and the wrong response can build the wrong future. Which is why the first thing I write has to be something that says, we did this because we had to. We are not what we were in those 11 years by default. We are what we are when we are not afraid and not pressed to the wall, and what we are then is something different. Something that wants neighbors rather than subjects, that understands the cost of dominance well enough not to want it, that has been watching its own history, long enough to know which parts of it stop repeating. Whether anyone believes that will depend on everything we do in the years ahead. But the sentence has to be written, and it has to be written now, and I am the one who has to write it. I sat down. I picked up the pen. I began. I do not know if we will get all of it right. I do not know what the 11 civilizations we are reaching toward will make of us when they learn the full story, or what their histories look like from inside them, or what it takes to rebuild when you have been occupied so long that occupation feels like weather. I do not know what other fleets are moving through the dark and distant systems right now, watching what happened here, and revising their understanding of what a small blue world with a short history and a habit of fighting itself is actually capable of when the situation demands it. What I know is this: we are still here. 7 billion people on a planet that was supposed to fall 11 years ago. Still here, not because we were more powerful in the way that power is usually counted. Not because we had better ships, or faster drives, or more advanced technology, or a larger fleet. Because 14,000 people kept a secret in the dark for a decade without breaking. Because a lieutenant commander in a metal hull faked a debris field with perfect hands and perfect timing, and sent back 3 words that told me the plan was intact. Because a man named George Adler fixed a broken part in the void with enemy ships 40 kilometers away, and reported back with 4 words that contained more calm courage than most people find in a lifetime. Because a room full of exhausted people ran calculations for 4 days in a bunker under Geneva, and held a line that 7 billion people did not know existed. Because we planned 11 years ahead when the universe expected us to look 11 minutes ahead. Because we are, at our best, precisely this: patient, thorough, quiet, and completely impossible to predict when it matters most. They thought they were surrounding us. They had no idea what surrounded them.